Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
We are honored to have with us the brilliant scholar, Imani Perry. Imani Perry is really one of the most important minds in the American Academy. And I think what makes Imani so special, and I said this when you were here for your last book, she wrote another book last week and another one. She wrote one while we was waiting to start. It's coming out next week. What I love about Imani is her profound and deep love for Black people, her love of justice, her intellectual adventurousness, and her commitment to thinking deeply across a range of disciplines and topics. She's not bound by discipline, although she's rigorously trained. She's not bound by one set of commitments. And you see that in her spirit, you see that in everyday life, but you also see it in her work. And there are very few people who could write a book like More Beautiful, More Terrible, this rigorous, deep, informed analysis of race that engages data. People in humanity sometimes don't do that data thing. And she's like, data, what's that? But she engages the data, she engages numbers, she engages sort of quantitative reasoning, but she's advancing a really profound argument. And to do that kind of work and have enough sort of diversity to be able to do a book like Prophets of the Hood, which is still my favorite book on hip hop in the Academy. And even the books that have come after it, the books that sampled Prophets of the Hood sometimes. Seems like you don't give me no alcohol when I do. Nothing is compared to Prophets of the Hood. And so Imani does this work, right? And then you write a book on the Black National Anthem, which doesn't just give us a kind of historical understanding of the song itself and the political context, but also advances an argument about Black formalism that is super important to know, that will help us think through other intellectual issues, other historical moments, other cultural spaces. Her work helps shape our analysis of other things. And so we'll talk about Bexy thing on another day, but that book just came out and it is so important, so interesting. So I can't say enough about that book. But looking for Lorraine, you're doing hip hop, you're doing race analysis, you're doing histories of Black National Anthem, and now you're a biographer. So, and of course the brilliant book on gender and gender theory, Bexy thing, which just came out. But Looking for Lorraine is such a special book. I remember when you sent me the first chapter, maybe 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. Was the first. She's like, I'm working on a little thing. And I'm thinking, people send you stuff and they be testing stuff. They be woodshedding, excuse me, testing out ideas. And she sends me this chapter that is marvelous. It's not just well written, but it's exquisite in its thinking, and it helped me think about Lorraine Hansberry in all these new ways just in that short piece. And I was like, how do you pull this off? How do you become a biographer too? I want to start there with you. First of all, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you. Shit, I'm gonna take you on the road.
It's not really like your work. I don't do that on office to come here. Sometimes like, they wrote a book, they're here, they'll be signing it.
Yeah.
What does it mean to become a biographer of Lorraine Hansberry?
Yeah, so it's a complicated question to answer because I was really resistant to calling the work a biography at first. But I have this problem as a writer, which is I never want to do things the way that the business of publishing says you're supposed to do them. So several times I've gone through this process where people are like, so what is it? And I'm like, it's like nothing you've seen before. And then they're like, where does it go in the bookstore? Right, so it is a biography, but I call it a third-person memoir in that I wanted. So there just hasn't been a lot of long-form work about Lorraine Hansberry. She's hugely important. Almost everybody has seen the film A Raisin in the Sun or read it in school, it is the most widely produced play by a black woman in American history. It is one of the most widely produced plays in American history, but people don't know her. And I also knew that there were folks who were writing like, more traditional, detailed biographies, and I didn't want to sort of intrude. But what I wanted to do was to give readers a sense of why she was so important, right? And she had this short life. She only lived to 34 years old. Why she's so important, and how she stands at the center of the historical moment. So because of that, my training in history was relevant. My training in literature was relevant because she was an intellectual, right? So there's times when I'm reading through her archive and I'm saying, okay, here's a note and she's really emotional or sad or something, but I can also tell by virtue of what she's saying here that she's been reading Hemingway, and because she's making a reference, right? And so for me, I'm like, okay, well, that's something I can do, right? I can talk about how she was an artist, but also a thinker. It's something I had to bring to her life, right? And similarly, sort of, she was a leftist, right? She's a hardcore leftist. That was something I could bring to the understanding of her life, right? I mean, that, from my own background, but also from my political commitments. So I felt like I had something to say about her, and every writing project for me is like it's like a discovery, right? It's not like, I don't enter them thinking, this is what it's going to be, right? Or this is how I'm going to do this. It's like, I have a question and I need to know, what do I need to know in order to answer this question, right? That's the first round. And then what do I need to know how to do in order to answer this question, right? So the information, but also what do I need to know how to like put together? And then the shape starts to form after that, right? And so,
it's such a liberating way to think about things.
It's a process of discovery. Yeah. You have to be unafraid to fail. To like, right? So maybe I'm too stupid to worry about whether I can do it right? But I'm like, I just want to figure this out.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so this book takes you into the archive. It takes you into letters, black letters. You begin in both spaces. Takes you to Chicago.
Yeah.
Talk to me about Chicago.
Okay, so to the New Yorkers, I apologize, but I think I'm trying to decenter New York in Black Studies because I think Chicago is really the heart of Black culture in the 20th century. It is where blues, the gospel music industry, writers, if not Chicago, the Midwest. I mean, everybody, Richard Wright. Even Langston Hughes, they claim in New York, he's from the Midwest. Ralph Ellison, right? Morrison is from the Midwest. I mean, and Chicago's the center of that, and there's the business district there, and then there's the political history, Black political power that develops. So Harlem has this beautiful history in terms of like this group of incredible artists and musicians, but Chicago, it's like the whole kind of cultural landscape shapes Black America over the course of the 20th century. So I want to talk about, and my work on Hansberry started with thinking through how Chicago could produce someone like her. I only think she would only have come out of Chicago.
Interesting.
Right. So
Chicago produces Lorraine Hansberry, which is somewhat counterintuitive to some of us East Coast folk who would like to see
I want to give Philly its place too.
I was gonna say,
I'm gonna get to there.
You in a tough place to be talking about Chicago as a center of Black cultural life. Well, I thought Philadelphians might appreciate decentering New York. Yes, but we want to go. We want to go south, not west. We just battle Detroit all the time. But it's interesting because Chicago produces Lorraine Hansberry, which was somewhat counterintuitive, but also, as you talk about in the book, a middle-class family produces Lorraine Hansberry, and produces a certain kind of figure with a certain kind of politics, which is in some ways sharp contrast to her upbringing, her family,
right?
etc.?
Yeah, so she has very different politics from her family. So her father, she talks about, is he's like really patriotic, real American type American, Republican Party operative. Like he's a race man, you know, so he's a civil rights activist, but he's very traditional, capitalist, right? And she tells a story about when she's a little girl. She's born in 1933, so she's born at the dawn of the Depression. She's a little girl. For Christmas, she's given a fur coat. And they send her to school, and everyone's like, "Oh, you're so cute." And she's like, "I look like a big stupid rabbit in the fur coat." And that's how she talks, right? So she's like, and then I went to school, and the kids like beat my ass, right? And which is excuse my language, right? It's the Depression, and she's wearing a white fur coat, right? But she had this feeling as a little girl that she understood, and she was mad too. Like, why would her parents send her to school with this fur coat on while everybody's hungry, right? And I think partially because, like, back then, black middle class people, even, you know, and they were really affluent for their community, but they still lived in the community, right? And so she was living up close with, often in the same buildings with, her father was a real estate mogul, often in the same building with tenants, right? So it wasn't like it was an alien experience or a different experience, right? So and the other thing she loved, and she talked about this a lot, she liked poor and working class kids were not respectable in the way, they're not always sort of so respectable and uptight about dealing with racism. She'd like, or any slight, she liked that they fought back.
Yeah.
She liked, and she thought that was, you know, she liked that people would, and she would tell stories about kids being like, "I heard you was talking about me," like getting people, she loved that, you know. So very early she started to admire the way that working class black folks interacted, and that led to her politics.
She gets to high school. This is one of the things that sounds so fascinating.
Yeah.
High school is an interesting place for her. A very unremarkable student, first of all.
Yeah.
I mean, like, real unremarkable.
Yeah, she got D in drama.
Right. And like a C in literature, right?
Yeah.
Right.
I love that. No, because, you know, so often we act as though those things are the measures of gifts or talents, and they are not. And they are the measures of a particular type of academic performance, but that is not the be-all and all of excellence. Yeah. And so I love that. You know, I always talk about, she was a college dropout, was not a remarkable student, was on academic probation when she was in college, and Baldwin didn't go to college. Right. And I just think we have to remind ourselves of that. Yeah. You know, particularly now when we try to identify where we're going to find genius. You know, just to not only look at a certain package.
While she didn't excel in school, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in her teen years, intellectually in particular. Talk to me a little bit about some of that stuff. Yeah,
so she's in the debate society. She's with, she's active in the debate society with James Foreman, who becomes a civil rights activist and is goes by Rufus when he's in school. So even like after they both become famous, he's signing his notes to her Rufus. And she's, you know, she has a mentor upstairs who is a black communist intellectual writer who's helping her develop politically. She's a voracious reader. Just relatedly to the previous point, she struggles in math and science. Even into her adult life, she's always very nervous about like buying things because she can't really make change. I mean, she really struggles with basic math, and she talks about that being the consequence of having a Jim Crow education. She talks about Jim Crow education in the North, but it's being a reader is what allows her. So she's reading adult novels when she's still in elementary school, but struggling academically and also missing a lot of pieces of education. She's blossoming. Even and constrained.
And dealing with some heavy stuff in the beginning.
Yeah.
One of the things I thought about also was, and you and I had talked, I had emailed you when I was doing the Palestine work, and I asked you about Lorraine Hansberry and what she thought about Palestine. And of course, Imani knows everything. She was like, look in the archive, like page 7, you know. But in high school in the senior year, one of the things they were debating was Russia and also the history of Palestine.
Yeah.
This is she graduated high school in 1948.
Yeah.
So interesting time.
Oh yeah, right at the moment of formation. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So she
they were super complex intellectual time. Yeah. Political time. And the thing that's that I think is really important also about that is that the way, and actually it's actually a lot about James Foreman's recollections of their high school years gave me a lot of information about her. So he would be like, well, she was involved in these conversations, but he was saying that was just like the milieu in the 1940s. Like high school kids were thinking about serious political questions as the world was realigning, right? Yeah, so.
Then she goes to Madison.
She goes to Madison, yes.
Why?
So this is an interesting question. So partially, she's going to Madison because the norm for a middle class, kind of fancy black young woman would be to go to Fisk or Howard maybe, or she should have, her cousins went to HBCUs and would have been, her father was an Alcorn grad. She decides to do something completely different. Very few black students at Wisconsin. It's a hotbed of student activism, so surely that's part of what attracted her. But also, I think she was part of her political activity. I think was drew her there, and she integrated a dorm, which was it's interesting.
It's super interesting, and again, her whole life is just so counter to what I would have expected.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things I want to ask you about because I don't want to go through entirely chronologically. Okay. Y'all gonna read the book.
We can jump around.
Yeah.
You think?
Oh, you can't not read this book. I can't tell you enough how much I enjoy reading it, and not just the content, but the actual writing.
Thank you.
Yes. Your writing style in this book is somewhat different than in Lift Every Voice.
Yeah.
And it seemed like you were making a very deliberate.
Yeah,
it
demanded a different kind of so this was like so much of what I feel is important about Hansberry is this blend of being someone who's very sensitive emotionally and being an intellectual and being an artist, and so I wanted to write in a way that a reader could feel her, right? So that even I wasn't going to cover every single detail of the life, but I wanted you to feel like you knew her when you read the book, right? And then for Forever Stand, I wanted to give people a sense of black institutions did this and black people did this when people didn't know black folks were doing this. Like it was a different kind of energy, so it had to be sort of written in a very precise style so that I could cover like thousands and thousands of documents.
That's a good word, precise. A lot of shorter sentences, but very powerful sentences. Very interesting literary choice. Also, perhaps more importantly, her friendships.
Yeah.
One of the friendships that cuts through multiple chapters in the book is James Baldwin.
Yeah.
Why was James Baldwin so important to her?
Oh, so they meet. He's already famous when they meet, and she's identified him as someone of immense talent. He's in Europe. He comes back, and they're doing a stage production of Giovanni's Room inside the Actors Studio, right? And Giovanni's Room is a controversial book because it has it's mostly framed around two male lovers, so he comes back and he's doing and stage production is not considered particularly good, and so she goes and she's sitting in the back, and she's not anybody at this point recognized, and there are all these like major critics who are like tearing it down, and he's devastated, and she stands up and she starts going in on them, right, and defending Baldwin, and he's like, who is this little tiny woman who's like, who's in the back, right, and unafraid to confront these sort of these major figures in the theater world, and that sort of becomes their relationship. He goes to her, he's a huge figure, but he is vulnerable with her. He asks her to read things for him. He says, "I'm nervous about this. Will you let me read it aloud to you? Will I?" There's a tenderness to their relationship. They drink together, they laugh together a lot, they fight like really intensely, so they yell and scream at each other and scare people in bars. And then they, then they stumble home drunk to their respective house. So they have a lot of fun, and there's also something about, like, they can just be relaxed and, for lack of better, like, very black with each other, in a way that, particularly once she's famous also, and they're doing all this presentation on television. If you ever hear the interviews, the perfect elocution and all that, and they just let loose when they're together. So it's like a preciousness, a tenderness to their connection, and then they share ideas all the time, and you can see her influence. This is one of the things that I hope, at least for the scholarly people, that they see from the book, is that she's a serious intellectual influence on him. She helps him push his politics to be more critical of race in the United States, issues around political economy and capitalism and all those sorts of things. Yeah.
That's the other reason why I thought this text was so important. There's often a tendency to look at both black women on the one hand and then artists on the other as people who were kind of in the historical movement. Yeah. But not necessarily helping to constitute that history.
Yes. Right.
Sidney Hook talks about the eventful man or woman, the event-making woman, man. They don't necessarily think about her as somebody who shapes these things. She's not just sitting next to Du Bois.
Oh no.
She's not just sitting next to Baldwin. She's not sitting at their feet, rather.
Right.
She's engaging in ideas. I mean, it seems to me that one of the most important contributions of this book is showing how she, in particular, but black women more broadly, are actually pushing forward and challenging these eminent thinkers. She's an interlocutor. She's not a student.
Oh, absolutely. And with Du Bois, it's really, I think Du Bois is sort of like, they love each other deeply, but also she is his favorite student. And that's a big deal, partially because she is someone who dropped out of school. She's not a formal student. Du Bois is like, Mr. Harvard and University, right? And he thinks that she is the person who can continue the legacy of the life of the mind. And that's incredible. He's the most, I think it's, he's the most important intellectual of the 20th century. Right, and he sees in her, he saw something in her uncle, William Leo Hansberry, who's the father of African Studies, was a professor at Howard for years. He met him when he was an undergraduate at Atlanta University, sent him to Harvard, right? But then with Lorraine, and then years later sees something similar in Lorraine, but really thinks of her in even sort of broader terms. Wow. Yeah. So
it's incredibly fascinating. Somebody who she didn't have as closer relationship with, I would argue, is Harold Cruz.
Yeah, no. Oh yeah.
He didn't want no parts. So talk to me a little bit about Harold Cruz.
Yes.
in Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, he goes hard on Raising the Sun, but more broadly on Hansberry, period.
Yes.
Why and how does that reading stand in such sharp contrast to the intellectual biography I see here? Because who Cruz thinks she is very different than who any of us think she is, but especially who you think her to be.
Yeah, Cruz is like, she's just a spoiled middle class girl, and I use that word deliberately. And she wrote a middle class play, and she's not really interested in the struggle for black liberation, right? And that perspective is really influential. Like, one of the most heartbreaking things for me is that, August Wilson was very dismissive of Lorraine Hansberry, even though she's clearly influential to his work, and he's one of my favorite playwrights also. But it's a very influential read that is incorrect. Baraka too, Amiri Baraka, and he would write letters to her that were mean. Like, he would be like, "You have nothing to do actually with Du Bois," and Paul Rose, like really kind of provoking her. And I want you to do a public forum so we can see that you don't, But he later realized he was wrong, and realized that what they thought, one, they were reducing her to her class background.
Yes.
But two, the fact that she was trying to do literary realism, right? She was trying to depict the desires and the choices that people actually made, and not just do like this sort of like, crude Marxist play about like the working class taking over, right?
Right.
You know, that people thought that it was just this middle class fantasy. And she would say, look, at the end of the play, you know that they're going into a place where people are going to be trying to kill them. Right, like this is not a happy ending, right? This is, you know, people trying to figure out a way to do something in their lives, right? Yearning for something, right? So yeah, so that's, you know, that was one very prominent read. Some of it was gendered, you know, like that she was dismissed as, you know, class, gender, and then I will say the part of it that was, if not fair, understandable, is that she becomes hugely famous. And lots of people like her play because they don't read it in a way that challenges them. Lots of white people read her play in a way that didn't challenge them. And so there are black writers who were like, you know, there's a problem that this is so easy for folks to digest. And that frustrated her too.
So the skepticism around her was partly about the white approval and the mainstream approval. Similar to Baldwin in that way.
Yes.
Which is also interesting in relation to Cruz, but also in relation to their connection, I'm sure, in some sense. They could bond around those things.
Yes. Although Baldwin was much more gracious about this stuff. Like, she would get pissed. You know, so she would like write angry letters. Yeah. Like she would say stuff like, there's one letter where she says to someone who's written something, some scathing criticism, she's like, you are extraordinary. You write a lot of words and they're all stupid, and that is extraordinary. Like, that's who she was. So Baldwin was always trying to like be gracious with people, and she was like, yeah.
She ain't suffer fools much.
No, and she got mad when she felt misunderstood.
Right, you know? And she felt misunderstood a lot.
Yes, she did.
She also experienced loneliness.
Deep loneliness.
And that's, again, it's cuts through the book, but it's a key part of the book. Talk to me about her loneliness.
Yeah. You know, it's a lot of different things. Like, I didn't want to give the impression. Some of it is where she's situated, right? So she becomes really famous very young. She is this black woman in this white theater world. She has friends who are in her activist world, but her sexuality as a lesbian woman that world is very different. It's overwhelmingly white and women who are not involved in politics. And then her activist world, those folks don't, for the most part, know that she's lesbian, right? And so she's like in between these worlds and isn't fully herself in any of them. And then she also has this husband, right, who she's split up from, and who knows about her sexuality, but they still are sort of pretending to the public that they're together. So there's just all these ways in which she's situated that are hard. And then I think she also experiences the kind of depression and loneliness that writers and artists often do, where she's like trying to find a sense. She wants the world. She wants a certain kind of world. She wants a certain kind of connection to other human beings. It's hard to get to. And so, yeah. So she writes through her emotional difficulty. Yeah. So
we all know Raisin.
Yeah.
What's the piece of her body of work that we overlook or don't appreciate fully?
I mean, both The Sign in Sidney Brewstein's Window and LeBlanc. And The Sign in Sidney Brewstein's Window is, I think, that was the play that was up when she was dying, that was pretty much panned by critics, but which I think is extraordinary. And a lot of people didn't like it because she was writing, not exclusively, but primarily about white folks, and they thought she had gone into areas she wasn't supposed to go into, and about life in the village, and for sort of leftists in the village. I think it is a remarkable book in terms of talking about feminism and sexuality. And then LeBlanc is, about an African nation at the dawn of independence, and thinking through about the ethics of getting free in like violence and revolution, and in some ways it's like, it's one of the very first plays that really does that. It does it beautifully because she is a serious student of African politics and history. Also deals with inheritances. Like she's always talking about like familial inheritances. You can see that her father is always working on her, like this question of what you know, living up to what your father wants. Deals with sexuality too.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so both of those plays are, and they just don't get produced very often.
Yeah.
You know.
I'm going to ask you a question that historians never answer, but I'm hoping
Maybe
you will.
I can because I'm not a real historian.
I feel like historians be trying to get off the hook with my question. Yeah, I see you. So we lost Lorraine so young. I mean, I was thinking about that today. She's younger than my father. Like she should still be with us, right? I mean, we would love for her to still be with us. If she were with us.
Oh goodness.
Right. See, Erica, like, no, I wouldn't answer that.
Just like,
use counterfactual. If she were with us, I guess I'm asking more about her trajectory, where she was headed. I mean, because she dies also at an interesting moment, right?
Right. She died. You know, she dies. She's like, she's dying for the last 2 years of her life. No one tells her what that she has cancer, right? Because it's kind of normal in that period. People withhold that information. So she sort of, you get the sense that she knows she's dying, but she's not being prepared until the very end. And it's so frustrating because she wants to go down south, right? So the Southern movement has captured her imagination. She's sending money, she's writing in support of it, but she wants to be there. And the thing that's special about that to me is that, like earlier, like when the Brown Board of Education opinion comes down, she's not really, like, she's thinking about what's going on in Kenya. Like, she's not really thinking about the U.S. political movement, right? And part of it is because she's from Chicago and she knows technically integrated schools don't really need integration, right? But then when the student movement starts to happen in the South, like, this is transformative to her. So she would have definitely gone down south. I don't know what she would have done at the tail end of the movement. She was very, very critical of for lack of a better word, establishment Negroes, right? People who were affiliated with the Democratic Party, who were sort of like, she was really, really hard on Ralph Bunche, right? That was with
good reason.
But you know, but I mean, just thinking about now, she would have been, you know, you and her would have been like throwing bowls on Twitter together, right? You know, like, really, because she was very critical of people who wanted to become part of the system, even though she understood that you could operate with integrity and be someone who was, and she saw it in her father, right? But she just didn't see that as a pathway to liberation. She thought revolution, militancy, you know. In many ways, she was more militant. I mean, talk about how, you know, Malcolm basically comes out of hiding because he has to go to her funeral.
Yes.
And this is when he's, you know, he knows he's about to be killed, and he's killed a couple of weeks later. But he goes to her funeral, you know, a public space where he's in hiding, right? And and that's because they really shared. And she gave it to him because he talked bad about her for marrying a white man.
Yes.
And so and he apologized after she cursed him out.
Yo, she got some high-profile Negroes to apologize to, man.
She did.
Mary Barack, he didn't apologize about 3 times his whole life. Man.
Yeah, but you know, so I can't answer where she would be, but I do know that her politics would be way out of the standard spectrum now. She might not be in the States, you know. She might be in the Caribbean. She might be in Latin America, Venezuela. Yeah.
Good one.
Yeah.
You make an interesting choice in the book that I was struck by. I'm going to actually.
Sorry, I'm just going to serve my iron deficiency immediately.
Oh, help yourself. I'm going to try and find this without. You know, I ain't make no note. I be doing books about in my head, man. I don't be writing notes down. But it's been a long day. So there's this moment where Oh, I know where it is. You're talking high school.
Yeah.
And in her...
Oh.
Yes, exactly. And there is this moment where someone writes to her.
Yeah.
An inscription, "Dear Lorraine, these years..." A woman writes this to her. "Dear Lorraine, these years I've known you have been the most wonderful in all my life. You don't know how I lived for each day when I could come to school each morning and behold your wonderful face. And now that we are parting, I don't know how I will go on. Please hurry back to me, dear one." Dear is capital D. "I would like to murder you. Yours always." There's also a certain playfulness in her high school yearbooks that Imani fleshes out in the chapter.
Every talks about her locker was junky.
Exactly,
right.
Exactly. They'll mix in like just jabs, right? "I love you, you ain't shit," kind of thing.
Yeah.
But you wrote, "The signature is scratched out. It appears to read Anita and something else is written on top in its stead. It might be Lynn, it might be Lipid. This palimpsest 70 years later, as I attempt to piece together Lorraine's story, is at first tempting. I want to unearth the first layer by deduction. Which girls' names began and ended in A? I ask myself, going through page by page, but then I decide to leave the mystery intact. The task of the biographer is always incomplete. No matter how meticulous she takes herself to be, the biographer mustn't venture from archaeology to intrusion or wild speculation, despite the intriguing possibilities of the latter two. The word scratched out could mean a number of things: secrecy, an inside joke, a romantic reference, a lifelong attachment. I don't know."
Yeah.
As the reader, I was like,
Yeah.
I want to show. I'm less interested in.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, that part of it.
But the whole phenomenon.
Right. Because
I do it again. Right. You know, like I do it again. So it's funny. There was a forum a couple of years before I even started working on her that was about, do we out Lorraine Hansberry? And I thought, and I don't want to be disrespectful to people in the conversation, but my response was, I just didn't think that that was the right question, because I thought in order to fully comprehend her work, you have to talk about her sexuality. She wrote lesbian themed fiction under pseudonyms. It was important. There's a whole archive. You had to talk about it. So it wasn't, to me, I didn't want to not, it wasn't a question of whether or not I was going to talk about it, but there was a question about how intrusive I was going to be into her life. And also, I wanted the work itself to be a meditation on what to do with figures historically who were not out, right? So there are bits and pieces. You know, there are people who wrote me and said, this person called me and said she had a relationship with her. You know, sometimes they wanted to be interviewed, sometimes they didn't. Right? There were people who said, I can't really talk about that, but yes, I was involved with her, right? So I wasn't interested in talking about, I wanted the writing to give a sense of the complication of what it meant to be a lesbian in the 1950s and 60s, right? And that there are clearly these deep attachments, deep love, and not just that, but she was working through her ideas about the world through thinking about her sexuality, and wanted to leave an archive of work about her thoughts about it. But it also is hazy in lots of places, and that's part of why it's not a traditional biography. Because I do think a traditional biography, part of what you do have, you know, what it calls you to do is to trace down all of those details. And there's something that was deliberately impressionistic about this, which is about, okay, what do we, you know, how do we work through the legacy? And even just recently, like someone who knows more details about her first major relationship approached me, and I was like, send them to that person who's writing the next book.
Right, I'm done, right?
Yeah, no, well, also because I want to leave space for people. Like, the idea is that, you know, you know, like, you think about how many books are there on Baldwin. Why should there be, you know, one answer? There should be dozens. Yeah. And we're late.
Right.
You know, she died at 65.
And I think that's the most stunning thing to me, is that she dies in 65 and there's so little written about her. And there's so many black women who died so young. Whose story I wish we knew more about. Toni Cable Bar. I wish we knew more about Octavia Butler. I wish we knew more even about Zora. I wish we knew, particularly in their own words.
Yes.
You know what I mean? But we don't have access to that. So this work becomes even more important.
And it was actually, I mean, and I talk a little bit about it, influenced by Alice Walker's work on Zora.
Yes.
And the way that she wrote about her as a way to bring her back into, and it did, right? People started reading Zora much more after Alice Walker wrote about her. So that was part of the inspiration. Yeah.
And that's why I like the idea of third person memoir as a way of framing it. I could talk to Imani all day, and I do anyway. So I'm gonna let you. I'd like for y'all to jump into the conversation. Questions?
Or comments?
Or comments, yes. We'll go here and then right there.
How you doing, Dr. Perry? Good to see you again. So when it comes to, your writing process, right? Prolific writer, we all know that, right? All the books are over there, some of them. And so
I was about to say, it's not all of them.
right, not three. But nevertheless, with your writing, when do you get to the point? You talked about like leaving space, right?
Yeah.
But when do you just say this is the time, right?
When you mean in terms of it being done?
Right, or at least like when you think that this is now the time that I can, say this is the first draft, and then you can, right? Because that's something that I think that with this kind of book, third person biography, as you say, it just feels like it would just be a tough time, right?
Yeah.
Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so part of it is I tell this story because I really do want to give people an accurate sense of my writing process. So someone once asked me, how long does it take you to write an article, like an academic article? And I said 3 years. And she was like, wait. And I was like, it takes me a long time to know what I want to say about something. So that's why I work on multiple things at once, because I will leave something alone if it starts to feel forced. I step back and I come back. I take a lot of notes. Like I write myself a lot of emails, and oftentimes I'll go back to them. So like I'm working on stuff now, and I go back in my emails literally from 10 years ago, where I'm like going through and thinking through. So my writing process is a little bit unconventional. When I actually get to the point where I'm like, yes, I'm drilling down in this project. One of the ways I know I'm getting to a first draft is I start to say the same thing over and over again. Okay. And so I come back to the same, right? Like, and I'm like, oh, I said that. Like, I got a response back from an editor recently, and she was like, okay, so you tell the story 4 times in the same, right? And I was like, oh, right, so that's a sign that is. So that's part of it. And like I do have something of a sense at this point. Like, I mean, it was different when I was writing a dissertation. But at this point, I have a sense of like, how big is this going to be? Like, how detailed is it going to be? Like, what's the shape of it? What am I going to do, but what am I just not going to do? And I also feel like everything is a learning experience. And I feel like I'm constantly growing. So I'm not afraid to let things go, because because the things that I fail at are part of the process of becoming better, right? So I think a lot of times academics in particular are afraid to let things go because they want things to be perfect. I know that's not going to happen. So I'm okay with, if it's, my standard is excellence, not perfection, right? And sometimes I am successful at that, and sometimes I'm not, and I can look back at something and be like, yeah, what were you doing in that chapter, right? Like, but I feel like it's great, and that's the benefit of this career, right? Both writers and scholars. It's a long, it's not like being a sprinter. It's a long, long career. Take time.
But that's an interesting balance. On the one hand, saying it doesn't feel perfect to let it go, but also not letting everything go. Right. There's some folk I wish would write less. So the fact that you're willing to sit with a book for 3 years or 4 years or 5 years.
But that's another motivation too, because I really do believe, like, I have a lot of stuff to say and I want to write a lot of books, but I also do believe that if I could write the perfect article, Like, but I mean, is there are some people who've written single articles that have changed the field for generations,
Absolutely.
right? That to me, I would feel very satisfied with my career, right?
Yeah.
Like so I guess it's also like my drive is not to be like the person who wrote 25 books,
Yeah.
right? Or like to have the
Yeah.
the biggest book contract and to be like that's not my motivation.
Right.
I mean, and I don't mean I'm not rejecting that.
Right,
Like,
actually, I'll take the contract, but-
yeah, that'd be great. But you know the driver is not that.
And it's important to note because Bonnie's had 3 books come out in 2018, but she didn't write them in 2017, right? I mean, this is
Right.
some because that's an important distinction.
And
to
I
make.
keep telling people like, you wrote 3 books. No,
Right.
this is like
Right.
between 7 and 9 years.
I was gonna say I remember reading
Yeah.
chapters of parts of Exy Thing at least
Long-
5, 6, 7 years
long
ago.
time ago. Yes.
And Lorraine, I've read 3
and
or so.
and it changed, right? Like the
Yes.
arguments changed because I was working on them for a long time.
Right, and that takes a certain kind of discipline, you know, and also a certain kind of generosity and humility to say, I'm not the final word on this. I'm also going to leave room for someone else. I mean, that's
big.
big and rare, and also in some ways operates against the academy, which almost demands a certain kind of output all the time. It's kind of particularly in the current moment, how much you got, how many did you publish, how many books you put, how much.
Yeah.
You know, they almost encourage you to put stuff out before it's done cooking.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, and like claim to something.
Right.
Right. Like this, I am the only person who does this.
Only
thing.
person who talks about this. Nobody ever better say nothing about Lorraine again.
And but I feel like if it's worth it, if it's something that's worth spending years of your life on, it's got to be worth more than one book.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like it's got to be
Right.
important enough to merit more than one
Exactly.
person saying something.
That's a solid
about
point,
it.
right? If I spent 10 years on it, then surely this person's important enough for someone else to spend some time and write a book and do
It
it.
seems like when it comes to like writing, especially for Black women, there's always that box that they put them in. Like it's either she's queer or she is Black or she is woman, but how do you merge those two together and still keep the authenticity without really being intrusive and like showing, oh, this is like in a rough sort of thing.
Sort of, you know, she would think about something and then she would like write a little story to try to think through the idea, right? And then you could see all the little threads of or she would be feeling something, like feeling sad, and then she would imagine like a perfect day, and then you'd get a sense of what she was wanting to bring to fruition in her life. And so I think she actually, I followed her lead in her story of who she was, like how she tried to figure it out. And so I feel like that's as much the journey of the book as the chronology of her life is to like. So I had one of the people I had a conversation with about the book said, talked about the double entendre in the title. It's like both I'm looking for Lorraine, but also this is what looking was for Lorraine, like how she looked, right? And so and that's so it almost didn't require that much work, but I will say that my evasion of that, what you're talking about, like a category stuff, I mean, that is part of the frustration that some people have with the book, right? Like, you're supposed to sort of write in really kind of definitive ways about this is who she was, and this, right, and this is what this meant in this period of history, and it's much more kind of amorphous, because that's how, I think, because that's how our lives are, you know, I don't know.
That's very interesting.
Hi, Dr. Perry. Thank you for your book. I'm glad to know that you work on several projects at one time, because I feel like I just bought the book on the National Negro Anthem like 3 months ago, maybe, and I haven't even read that. But I wanted you to back up, and so the question the gentleman behind me asked about her interaction with Robert Kennedy.
Yeah.
Can you speak, like, bring that to now, like the juxtaposition about our own agency and not being afraid to protest the way we want to protest or speak the way we want to protest, and maybe Colin Kaepernick. So there's this thing about he shouldn't take a knee during the national anthem because it's disrespectful. But I have this theory that protesting is part of being an American, or, you know, speaking your truth is part of being, it's just as American as being traditionally patriotic.
Yeah. No, I mean, so she was very, she gave this talk where she told this story about how she tells a story about how people are really upset because CORE has a stall in New York where they basically stop traffic. They stand and everybody's all agitated, and then she makes fun of white liberals being like, you Negroes are going to ruin everything we're trying to do for, like, you know, racial, like we're in charge. And she talks about how her father always, you know, did things the respectable way, right? And then he dies. He actually leaves the country because he's so bitter and frustrated and decides to move the family to Mexico.
That's such a random. I'm so shocked by that.
Well, you know, Langston Hughes' dad did the same thing. Alicia Rashad did. I think she did.
I guess because he was so respectable, though.
Yeah. Well, he was like
leaving seemed that, you know.
Yeah, he was like done. You know, he tried everything and just felt like these, you know, these folks ain't never gonna change, right? I mean, that was the formulation, right? And so she said, so think about my father dying, you know, a bitter, frustrated man who'd put all his talents in trying to protest the respectable way, bringing lawsuits and acquiring wealth, and he just says at the end, forget it, I'm going to Mexico. And he has a brain aneurysm and dies, so the rest of the family doesn't ever move there, so she's in high school when it happens. So for her, she's like, so that isn't, you know, has made her think people should do everything and anything to get free. She's like, we have been trying since 1619. That's her formulation. We have, and she said, we were producing newspapers in slavery. You know, we were, you know, she just went through, she's like, every possible strategy. So now, and this is what she's saying in the 60s, she's like, if people want to stay in the middle of traffic, if people want to get some guns and go in the hills, whatever it takes to be free, right? And, you know, when I was writing this, I was like, look, I'm sure a lot of readers are not going to agree with this politically, but I think it's really important for to think about a beloved figure who had the courage to say this and not be worried about risking her fame when she said it.
Yeah.
That she was willing to say it, and she was willing, and also willing to speak to the moral correctness of it, because whether or not it was it would be wise to say, we've been being killed, we've been enslaved, we've been beaten, we've been robbed, like all of these things, how could you say there's something morally wrong with fighting back?
Your question also invokes, you talk about patriotism, and I was thinking about a claim you make toward the end of the book. You said Lorraine Hansberry rejected the American project, but didn't reject America.
No, she's deeply American. Yeah.
So say what you mean by that.
So she used to say things like, everybody's always like, I should go to Europe. I'm not interested in Europe, right? Like, she was interested in, you know, she was interested in Latin America. She was interested in the Caribbean. She was interested in sort of making sense of what it meant to be black on these shores, even though she was an internationalist, right? And and the history she wrote, she had work in progress that was about Native Americans, or she was really wanted to sort of weed through an understanding of what had happened here and all of its ugliness and all of the beauty. And she's, I mean, part of the reason I love her is that she just had such deep regard for our history here, right? And for black people. You know, there was you shouldn't have any ambivalence. She wasn't one of these people about black people need to do this. The problem with black people is that wasn't her, you know, she was in awe of the journey that had been taken, right? And so I think that was part of the reason why she was so deeply, I mean, she was trying to like figure out how do we tell the story here, you know, in order to people to understand how extraordinary our people are. And that's also the influence of Du Bois on her.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Would you classify her as a Pan-Africanist, and what were her, how did she interact with the African diaspora?
That's a great question. So I was absolutely a Pan-Africanist, and that was part of, she actually studied African studies formally with Du Bois, and then also, you know, her uncle was a mentor, and her uncle was actually, at Howard, educated lots of African independence leaders. So there were lots of the African students who came through Howard ultimately went and became people, and so he maintained those connections. And so she was sort of connected to, she identified as a Pan-Africanist, and also in some ways as a black nationalist. and it manifested for her most explicitly in her belief in self-determination, right? So she was a strong critic of capitalism. She believed in socialism, but even more than that, she believed in black self-determination. So however black people imagined the political communities, right? So she was completely taken with Patrice Lumumba. You know, she just collected all these little, you know, all these articles about everything about him, and furious, not just at the U.S. government for its involvement in his assassination, but also this was one of her times of really going at Ralph Bunche, because Ralph Bunche, you know, there were lots of black protests in the States about what the U.S. government had done to Patrice Lumumba, and Ralph Bunche sort of said, oh, you know, those are just kind of rabble-rousers. That's not really how black people think. And she went at him for that, you know, about sort of that kind of identification with American power structure, right? So yeah. But she didn't travel to Africa at any point in her life. So she studied a lot, but she wasn't there. And she was obviously knew a lot of Africa. And her favorite character in A Raisin in the Sun is Joseph Asagai. People often talk about Beneatha, and I also think people talk about, yes, Beneatha is based on her, but a lot of her ideas come out of the mouth of Joseph Asagai in the play. Yeah. So.
Now I wish we had talked about Raisin a little bit more, because there's that tragic scene. I know. I just think about that window. As I said at the beginning. No, thank you. Thank you for giving so many of your gifts to us. And this book is so special. It's so beautiful. And you've certainly done right by her. So please give